Hello, everyone. Classic mistake of failing to unmute myself. I'm Julia Skorupska, and I am the head of the Powering Past Coal Alliance Secretariat. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you all to this webinar today that we're hosting, the Powering Past Coal Alliance is hosting. The Powering Past Coal Alliance is a coalition of national and subnational governments, businesses, and organizations working to advance the transition from unabated coal power generation to clean energy. Over 165 national and subnational governments, businesses, organizations, utilities represent an amazing reservoir of experience of people who have been confronting some of the challenges and overcoming these challenges while delivering their energy transitions. We see our role as an alliance being to harness this amazing experience to accelerate and support transitions across the world. And as part of this, we've launched a new series of knowledge sharing webinars. Today is our first webinar, and we're going to be looking at grids. One of the top priorities for any government, obviously, is making sure that the lights stay on during the energy transition and that reliability is maintained. Grid system operators and planners are obviously key to that. And that's why we're so pleased to have such a great lineup for our webinar today. And in that lineup of expertise, we're starting with Binu Jayakumar, who is the Director of Electricity at Pembina. And we're really pleased that she's here with us today to moderate the workshop. Over to you, Binu.
Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to moderate today's session with experts on grid transition. I don't know if I'll count myself in the same caliber as the rest of the folks on the screen. I'm dialing in today from the province of Alberta in Canada, where we're going to be phasing out coal by the end of this year. It's 7 years ahead of schedule. But just like many of the jurisdictions that folks are dialing in from today, my province is also navigating tough questions around how to transition a grid that was dominated by coal to one that's more diverse while maintaining reliability of the system, like Julia was saying. And that's what we're here to discuss today over the next 57 minutes or so. We'll kick off our session with some opening remarks from the German Energy Agency, followed by our feature presentation by the UK's National Grid, and a presentation from the California perspective by the California Independent System Operator. And we'll wrap up with some Q&A with our speakers. So for folks who are dialing in, please type your questions into the Q&A box throughout the session, and we'll collect them as we go. You'll find that Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now for the opening remarks, I'll invite to the screen Ms. Friederike Wenderoth, who is the team leader for energy infrastructure at the German Energy Agency.
Yeah, thank you, Binu. And hello from my side. I'm Friederike Wenderoth of the German Energy Agency, and it's an honor to be able to make some opening remarks in this webinar today. Germany is a member of the PPCA, and we support the PPCA activities. And as the PPCA supports different jurisdictions in transitioning towards clean energy, its mission is also to foster the dialogue on the technological, economical, political, and social implications of this transition. And this fully corresponds to the mission of the German Energy Agency, where I lead this energy infrastructure team. And the German Energy Agency is a federally owned German agency that provides consulting to shape and implement Germany's energy and climate policy goals. And every day we here at DENA, or the German Energy Agency, focus on the dialogue about the multi-stakeholder perspectives on a just, clean energy transition. And I would like to give you a little bit insights on the German progress and perspectives. And let's start with the historical reduction of coal in Germany. A year after I was born in 1990, our coal reduction was at our coal consumption was at 36% of the primary energy consumption, 5,500 petajoule. And in 2029, this was reduced from 36 to 20% and 2,300 petajoule. So the coal consumption on the primary energy consumption in Germany halved in 30 years. At the same time, the security supply of electricity in Germany remains high. The integration of renewable energy has not yet had a dramatic effect on the security of supply, and our average system interruption duration index in minutes has almost halved since 2006, since we measured it, and it remains at a very low level of 12 to 15 minutes since 2014. And with regard to the ongoing energy transition, this is a very positive sign. And the already high increase in distributed energy plants and the electrification of heat and mobility, this has had no negative effect on the security of supply and the reliability so far. Concerning the coal phase out, our Coal Phase Out Act from 2020 provides for a coal phase out in Germany in 2038. And the end of electricity generation by burning coal should therefore come before 2038 by law. And in parallel, the economic structure in the affected regions is to be strengthened. However, our German government now aims towards an earlier coal phase out by 2030 as well. And after intense negotiations, the phase out in North Rhine-Westphalia, one of our German countries, will take place in 2030, 8 years earlier than originally planned in the law 3 years ago. And further negotiations with further countries are expected in the future, of course, and are already ongoing and started. The transformation towards a climate neutral and coal-free system by 2024, where I see the coal phase out as a very important cornerstone or milestone on the way, needs an integrated strategy for all sectors. And this is because the interaction between the different areas of the energy system and the sectors are increasing. With a system development strategy, which is a strategy process hosted by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Protection in Germany, we are developing a cross-sectoral mission statement and a robust energy strategy for the transformation of the energy system. Because without a consolidated strategy, there is no reliable planning premise for our energy infrastructure and our grids. And we need to decide now where we need to build hydrogen infrastructure and where we need to reinforce or adapt the existing electrical grid. And on the side, there are other high priority processes going on in our ministry, considering system stability in terms of voltage, frequency, and resonance stability, the organization of ancillary services, and the market design as well. Because the transition towards a coal-free and climate-neutral electricity system requires a smart orchestration of the infrastructure, the market, and the technology as well. And as an engineer, I would like to go deeper into the technical details later in this webinar as well, and it will stay for the Q&A. And I will close with the remark that the structural transformation of the affected regions, the energy market design, the infrastructure planning, and the technology developments must go hand in hand for the development of a climate neutral energy system. Thank you. And I wish you all a fruitful and inspiring exchange.
Thank you, Vijika. I think you've kicked off with some fruitful and exciting exchanges here. It's really inspiring to see jurisdictions like Germany and even regions within Germany accelerate the coal phase out beyond the dates that were originally discussed. Those are some remarkable stats you shared, having coal consumption without compromising reliability. Picking off on where you left off there, there's also been similar extensive infrastructure planning happening in the UK, in addition to solutions that are being implemented right now to deal with operability challenges and transitioning from a coal to clean grid. And to share that experience, I invite from the UK, Mr. Amir Alikhanzadeh, the International Grid Decarbonization Manager at the National Grid, and Mr. James Greenhalgh, Project Director for Strategic Infrastructure Projects at the National Grid.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Welcome to this webinar. So, as we said, I'm Amir Alikhanzadeh. I'm International Grid Decarbonisation Manager from National Grid Group. And today, with my colleague James, we will be covering and give you an overview of GB's grid development journey and a range of challenges that we are facing through this energy transition. If you move to the next slide, please. So just before going through the presentation, just give you an overview of our electricity business in GB. National electricity transmission system in GB is mainly made up of 400 kV, 275 and 132 kV infrastructures and different assets, separately owned generators and demand that are connected to this system. We have different business units in GB. We have National Grid Electricity System Operator, which is basically being responsible for moving electricity around the whole country, second by second, and try to keep the supply and demand balanced in a reliable manner for the whole GB. I think it's worth saying that this business unit will be completely separated from National Grid Group from 2024. Then we have National Grid Electricity Transmission, basically owns and maintains the transmission network in England and Wales, the blue shaded area on the right-hand side of this slide. We've also recently expanded the footprint of our business to get closer down to the consumer level. So we have National Grid Electricity Distribution, which owns and operates the largest distribution system in the UK, in Midlands area, and finally National Grid Ventures, that they've got a diverse portfolio of flexible and low carbon technologies in the UK, in Europe and US, including about 7.8 gigawatt of interconnections in operation or under constructions with the mainland Europe. I think it's worth saying that the energy landscape is changing. So as a business and as a responsible business, we are very keen to share the lessons that we've learned from network operators and network owners' perspective during our ongoing journey to decarbonize the power system. And we believe that international collaboration is key in order to reach net zero. If you move to the next slide, please. I think this slide just gives you an example in terms of our international engagement and collaboration with different countries. I think it's worth saying that obviously in our engagement is not just limited to these the working groups or initiatives, but it gives you a nice flavor in terms of our engagement. We're part of different working groups, different initiatives, programs such as the Green Grids Initiative, Energy Transition Council, Mission Innovation, and also as a result of those, and also our engagement with the UK government. We are supporting different countries as part of peer-to-peer engagement, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, based on our time and resource availability. If you move to the next slide, please. So in terms of the agenda for today's presentation, so we split it into two parts. In the first part, we will give you an overview of grid development journey from 2000 until now. And then in the last part, we will be covering a range of future challenges that we are facing to operate the system. Move to the next slide, please. Great. So this slide gives you a snapshot of key milestones in GB's journey towards grid decarbonization. So if you look at the pie chart on the top left, you can see where we were in 2000 in terms of the energy mix. As you can see, the system is being dominated by coal and gas. And then since 2000, a range of policies and frameworks were introduced by the government, which James will go into the details in the next few slides. But as a result of those, if we compare that pie chart with 2010, you can see, the share of coal is reducing, and we could see more and more onshore and offshore being connected to the system. And again, we saw a range of policy interventions and market design solutions. And as a result of those, if we compare it to 2020, you could see coal is disappearing, and then we could see more renewable energy sources being connected to the system. And if you compare all of those three pie charts to the one that we need to be, on the bottom right, by 2050, according to one of our future energy scenarios, you could see the scale of challenge in the future is even much bigger. So we need just to focus more in terms of how we can decarbonize power systems in the future. If you move to the next slide, please. In terms of the achievements, I think it was saying that it was in 2017 that for the first time we managed to run the system for 24 hours coal-free. Also between 2013 and 2020, the carbon intensity of power sector in GB reduced significantly, about 66%. And also we saw Britain's longest coal-free run between April and June 2020 for more than 68 days. In 2020, we saw the connection of world's largest offshore wind farm, Hornsea 2, to be connected to the system, about 1.3 gigawatt. And this year, we've seen a range of records being broken. For example, in January, we managed to dispatch about 21.6 gigawatt of wind, while the demand was around 40 gigawatt. And in April, we've seen Britain's solar record about 10 gigawatts, while the demand was about 33 gigawatt. And quite recently, in April, we've seen the greenest day in GB's history in terms of CO2 emissions. Now, I'll just pass it on to my colleague, James, who will give you an overview of Great Development Journey from 2000 till now.
Thank you, Amir, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'd just like to say thank you to Frederick for your introductory comments there, because very reassuring and very heartfelt that the experiences that you have in Germany are very similar to the experiences that we've had in the UK, particularly when you mentioned stability issues, thermal issues, voltage issues on your network. And those are particularly things that we've seen many challenges in those areas on the GB system over the last 20 years as we could have embarked on our renewable journey within UK. So it's reassuring that we see similar things, and it's also reassuring that that means our sort of pledge and our desire to improve technologies to reduce some of those things will come from many countries in the world, not just one or two. So it's quite helpful from that perspective. Amir has highlighted in his intro so far some of the major milestones and achievements that we've seen on the GB system from a renewable energy perspective over the last 23 years, going right back to 2000, when the GB system had virtually no renewable generation as such connected to it. In fact, on the transmission system, none at all. Taking us on to the sort of first 24 hours of coal-free operation in 2017, and then on from there over the next sort of 3 or 4 years to achieve 68 days consecutive running without any coal on the network. Pretty big highlights and headlines in the world of moving towards removing coal from the system. The one thing I'd probably like to note though here is that, unfortunately, due to the challenges that we've had with the situation in Ukraine over the last 18 months or so, our reliance on coal has had to sort of take a slightly slower step through this last winter. And whilst GB was in a position with only 3 remaining coal units connected to the system up until 2 years ago, we did actually have to bring back into operation 2 coal units for last winter in order to ensure we had security of supply. So as we move through the challenging times that we've got ahead of us, we'll always need to maintain that ability to sort of challenge ourselves and maintain security of supply, assuming we want to maintain that level of keeping the lights on for the future. It's important to note as well that whilst I'm talking about political intervention, a lot of these achievements and targets that Amir talked about were in many cases were as a result of a lot of government and regulatory policy interventions. Those policies that introduce market signals into the GB market that in turn drove the investment in renewable energy and therefore achieved us to reach some of these targets. In particular note to point out the GB electricity market since 2000 has been a commodity market. It is a self-dispatched generation market. Suppliers are responsible for identifying their levels of demand required on their system and to secure that demand through bilateral contracts with generators. And those generators in turn responsible for meeting those contracted positions under a purely self-dispatched market scenario. That particular market structure is currently being reviewed and may be amended in the future in line with our sort of government policy objectives on renewables, and whether or not that remains the right market structure to continue to achieve the targets that we've got in place for 2030 and out to 2050. So have a little look on this slide at some of those market signals and those interventions that we've seen come about. I mentioned already that the GB energy market is a self-dispatched wholesale market that took place back in 2000 when NETA was brought into being. NETA stands for the New Electricity Trading Arrangements. They were brought in the year 2000, and subsequently in 2007 that was replaced by BETA, which was the British Electricity Transmission Trading Arrangements. Prior to BETA, the electricity market in GB was just self-dispatched in England and Wales, and in Scotland it was dispatched by the system operator in Scotland. Under BETA, that transferred to a GB model, so the whole of GB energy is now dispatched centrally is dispatched self by the generators, and is monitored and balanced centrally by the system operator. Suppliers contract bilaterally for the amount of demand that they need on their network, and typically on a day-to-day basis in the UK, we see around about 2% mismatch between that contracted point and the actual demand on the day. So the system operator remains responsible for balancing around about 2% of national demand at any point in time. So the Climate Change Act in 2001 was really the first thing that introduced a focus on energy efficiency for Great Britain and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that in itself set the scene for increased renewables in the electricity supply makeup in Britain. This was sort of further encouraged by a renewables obligation in 2002. And in that obligation, suppliers are incentivized to source a percentage of the energy that they're contracted for to come from renewable resources. The aim being that that would introduce signals into the market to attract people to invest in renewable technology, because they knew there would be a market for that. So that was quite a strong case, and did start to see large volumes of wind generation being developed in the UK. By 2010, that volume of renewable generation trying to connect to the network had started to see congestion in the connection timeframes to the transmission network due to the reinforcements that were required on the network. So essentially, so much volume of connections had come forward that the ability to build that transmission infrastructure and get those units connected quick enough had outweighed the performance there. That introduced the connect and manage regime, where the regulator allowed the connections of all renewable generation to be made onto the system ahead of that system reinforcement, and managing the flows on the transmission network with those additional renewables on the system was managed from a cost perspective to the consumer, and attracted a faster process to introduce transmission reinforcements, but with a focus on connecting the renewables first. Even with these developments in 2012, the GB government forecasted that it probably was unlikely to meet its renewable targets for 2020 and 2030 without a faster rate of deployment of renewables. It was also starting to see security of supply issues as a result of market volatility introduced by renewables, essentially picking up more of a share of the load curve than the older conventional generation on the network. And as a result, very spiky prices at certain times of day, and starting to see more thermal generation, conventional generation starting to close as a result of lack of opportunity in the market, and then knock-on impact of security of supply. So that's when the GB government rolled out the electricity market reform mechanism. That came with two particular products to address security of supply. Was the capacity market, which we do see many capacity markets around the world today, and the one in the UK still exists, and a contract for difference mechanism, which was aimed at providing additional incentives for renewable technology through a subsidy mechanism. So further government intervention continued to be required, and we continue to sort of see investment in renewables, as Amir has pointed out, a number of targets to be hit. But we we believe in GB that there will continue to be a requirement for government and regulatory intervention in this sort of commodity market environment for some time to come. So we'll continue to look at that. If you could move to the next slide, please, Lena. Thank you. So this slide illustrates the sort of changes that we've seen on the GB system over a period of time. As I mentioned, the changes resulting from investment signals created through market intervention, and the graph on the right, you can see overlaid the different policy mechanisms that have been introduced over periods of time to drive that improvement and that performance in the renewable space. The graphs show really clearly, the one on the left shows how reliant the UK was on both coal and gas, and nuclear sort of underpinning the base load in the early 2000s. And to note that back in sort of 2000, 2001, the volume of energy in the market in GB was around about 70 to 75% provided by fossil fuel, with the remaining 25% coming from nuclear. By 2005, the climate change commitments that we'd had resulted in lots of coal units closing. Those units in many cases reached the end of their asset lives. But policy direction from a government perspective was quite clear. And as would happen in many other cases, life extension would often be the case. But in this event, that wasn't the case. Many of those coal units did close because the sort of financial viability of those projects long term just wasn't there. Probably also worth noting that in GB prior to 2000, we didn't have gas to generate electricity at all. So it wasn't legally allowed until the Electricity Act in 2000, which is when we started to see an increase in investment in gas generation. Around about the 2005 point, alongside the reduction in the coal units, we started to see an increase in gas units being rolled out as well. So quite an active period from the fossil fuels perspective, but cleaning up from that perspective. The graph on the right here shows the sort of wind and the solar development over the 20-year period, and clearly shows an enormous increase in the development and the policy interventions overlaid on that. That gives a sense of how successful those policy interventions are. And really that's the purpose of showing that, is to make it really clear that in a commodity-based market, you do need some driver to ensure that from an investment perspective, there will be the financial backing required to bring forward that level of investment in renewables. Helena, if you could move on, please, that'd be great. Thank you. So now we're going to have a look here at where we are today and the generation mix itself. This data is a position for 2021-22, so a year or so out of date, but good. First thing to note being that the percentage change in the energy mix from wind versus fossil fuels, with sort of 38% coming from renewables alongside a fossil fuel rating of 19% in 2021. And as I mentioned earlier, comparing that to the sort of 70-75% share back in 2005 is quite a significant change. It's probably also worth noting that in 2005, 40% of the fossil fuel background was coal. As of today, as I mentioned at the beginning, that is down to only 2 remaining coal-fired generators on the UK system. And those 2 coal-fired units are genuinely the only capable units available to run with coal. So all other coal units have been completely closed, and we hear would be impossible to reopen them. In part, this has been made possible by the gas generation strategy that I talked about a few minutes ago, which in the UK is still making up quite a sizable proportion of our levels of security of supply, and it's what gives us the flexibility on our system. With renewables, clearly, we're very reliant on weather, and in weather certainly in the northern hemisphere around GB is not particularly easily forecastable. So we're very sort of focused to intermittent generation being a challenge. So needing that flexibility in the system is important. Amir will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. As the volume of renewables has increased, system generation background is more intermittent, as I mentioned. Helena, could you move on, please? I'm conscious I'm probably running out of time. So and the next slide again, please. Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit here around the challenges that we see with the energy transition. Essentially, the generation background that we're seeing today, with more renewables, more intermittency, and less sort of dispatchable generation, means that things are more challenging from an operational perspective. We need to change our operating standards and our policies on a sort of monthly and yearly basis, and develop new processes and identify both new technologies and new market solutions to help us manage the day-to-day challenges that we see on the network. These challenges also affect how we invest in the network in the future. The location of renewable generation in the UK particularly is very different to the original sources of fossil fuel generation. And those sources of fuel generation were what essentially shaped the existing network structure as we see it today. So now we see energy flows on the network very different, and that in itself presents many challenges that are different, which I'll take a little look at for a couple of minutes now. Helena, I've got to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So thermal challenges being a particular impact for GB, and have had a significant effect on the cost to operate our network over the last 10 to 15 years. This map shows the existing network in GB. And as I mentioned, a lot of our renewable generation is around the coast of Scotland and on land in Scotland, so up at the top of this particular map of Great Britain, for anybody who doesn't know where Scotland is. But historically, GB generation was mostly situated in the north of the country and the Midlands, with the demand being in the southeast, which typically was London and its surrounding areas. And so the majority of energy flows were from the north, where the generation was, down through the network to the south. This heat map on the left-hand side of this graph shows a particular problem around what we call the B6 boundary. It's identified on the graph as well, but it's essentially that boundary between Scotland and England and Wales. And the volume of renewable energy that's coming from the Scottish network into Britain, into England rather, to help us provide the demand in the Midlands and south of England, is hugely constrained by a very small number of network infrastructure circuits that connect the Scottish network to the England and Wales network. So essentially meaning that in order for us to get to our 2030 and 2050 targets, we do see a need for massive investment in our transmission network. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Lena. And that leads me on to this particular slide, where we start to look at the improvements and the benefits that we'll see on the network in GB in the future. I've talked quite a lot about the need for collaboration between government and regulator, and the holistic network design programme is a prime example of where that's happening. The latest developments that we have here essentially demonstrate that through the holistic network design process, in order to meet the 2050 targets that we've got for offshore wind of 50 gigawatts, we will need significant investment. So on the slide, the map on the right identifies where new network infrastructure is required. When you look at it, you can see it's very different to the existing network that it sits there. We're starting to move our network offshore in many cases to enable us to sort of bypass some of those old circuits that run from north to south. But what's good from a government commitment perspective is that the commitment to build this network has been signalled by the government, by the regulator, and has been identified by the network companies who've shown very clearly where reinforcements are needed. So some of the construction work has started. I'm very pleased to be able to report at this point, but there's lots more needed. And many of these circuits that are identified on here are only in the sort of planning and consenting timeframes. And alongside that, one of the other challenges is that we need a very strong supply chain to enable us to deliver some of these projects. Typically, building a new overhead line circuit in Britain takes anywhere between 8 and 12 years, with the majority of that period being through planning consenting processes. So to rig up a supply chain able to deliver the volume of projects we've got here is going to be a tall order. I'm going to hand over to Amir here. He's going to talk a little bit more about some of the operational challenges, but thank you.
Perfect, thanks, James. The next slide, thank you. So here in this slide, as James mentioned, we need to mitigate a range of challenges to operate the system zero carbon. And this slide gives you a very high level illustration of a range of challenges that we are facing, and a range of solutions and actions that we can consider. So you can see that we have 4 pillars in different colors. Those are the challenges that James mentioned. And if you look at the left-hand side, we have a list of what we call them operability challenges, from frequency response and reserve, system stability, managing the voltage of the system, thermal constraints, restoration, and energy balancing. I think it's worth saying that we need to have dedicated deep dive sessions for each of them, but I just give you a very high level overview of potential solutions for each of them. So I start from frequency. So we need to keep the frequency within operational limits, and this means that we need to create new products to support largest loss on the system in the future, and also for the periods of rapid ramping due to level of interconnections and also coordinated EV charging in specific regions. We also need to create faster acting response products closer to real time, and also we need to create more granular service windows to facilitate low carbon technologies such as wind and solar to also provide response and reserve products that we need. Focusing on stability and voltage. So we know that the role of inverter-based technologies would be significant in the future, and we believe that grid forming capability would play a major role in the future in order to mimic the characteristics of conventional power plants. Stability could be, inertia, short circuit level, dynamic voltage, and in GB, we've seen about 40% reduction in system inertia over the last decade, which is a significant number. And this means that we need to find alternative ways of maintaining system strength and also voltage. At the moment, we are looking at Pathfinder projects. They are long-term contracts to make sure the National Grid ESO, they have access to the system stability. And also we are investigating to create world first market for stability and voltage as well. Those markets, they could be short-term or a long-term or a combination of both. But the main purpose of those is to increase liquidity of the market and create route to market for different technologies. The role of DER and DSR will be significant. We need to enhance coordination between transmission and distribution networks to mitigate the stability and voltage challenges. Moving to thermal constraints, as James mentioned, thermal constraints in GB, it's not necessarily a security issue, it's more around cost issue really. So we need to have more holistic approach when investing in offshore and onshore grid infrastructures to make sure that they are cost effective, and we need to create route to market for low carbon flex technologies. This means that we need to have a stronger investment signals for different types of battery storage or energy storage, really incentivizing demand turn up, or focusing on more innovative solutions such as time of use tariffs. System restoration is another challenge. I think it's worth saying that in GB we have a very reliable system. The reliability of system is about 99.99998%. Which is a high reliability. So we need just to make sure that the distributed energy sources, they would be able to provide system restoration. And finally, it's energy balancing. So we need to strive about flexibility and more granular price signals in wholesale market. Just conscious of time. So I think the last slide, I won't go into the details, but it's really the role of flexibility of the system. So in terms of different sources of flexibility that we've got in GB, because we anticipate that half of the year we're going to have more generation by 2035, and this is a significant number. So the role of storage, interconnectors, and other technologies will be significant in the future. I think that's it from us.
Great. Thank you, Amir and James. That was remarkable, UK's journey from coal to clean, and also how quickly you were able to fit that into 20 minutes or so. Thanks really for sharing that helpful breakdown also in that second last slide around the major operability challenges you're facing. I think a lot of us are facing the same challenges, and it's good to see that they're not necessarily insurmountable. We're going to continue with our presentations, but I just want to remind folks that if they do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to them at the end after our conversations. Moving across the pond, I'd like to invite Mr. Sean Grant and Mr. Darren Lamb, Operations Policy Managers at the California Independent System Operator, to discuss how California is leveraging clean energy resources to replace the services provided by thermal generation. Over to you, folks.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Sean Grant, California ISO. So during our presentation today, we'll be providing a brief overview of the legislative actions that have been taking place over the past couple of decades in California to reduce our carbon footprint. Additionally, we will be discussing where the highest California ISO currently is at meeting those renewable goals. The three topics we'll be discussing today will be driving California ISO's transition to a cleaner grid, a summary of where the California ISO currently is at, and have we been able to maintain system reliability during this transition? Next slide, please. So first, we'll take a quick overview of some of the legislative actions that California's taken over the last few decades to help reduce our carbon footprint. As you see here in 2002, we have renewable portfolio standards, the RPS. California's renewable electricity procurement goals were 33% by 2020 and 50% by 2030, which aim to then the greenhouse gases. They wanted to reduce to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And actually by 2017, California's three largest investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, collectively served 36% of the electricity sales with renewable power, beating that 2020 deadline. Then in 2018, California introduced Senate Bill 100, which set a goal of achieving a decarbonized power system by 2045. The groundbreaking policy requires that the 100% of electrical sales to end-use customers come from renewable energy and zero carbon resources by 2045, paving the way for a sustainable and cleaner energy future. As of April 2023, we make significant progress towards our renewable goals. The current installed renewable resources at the, next slide, please. Thank you. So we made significant progress. The current installed renewable resources at the ISO, we have 28 gigawatts, as you see there, with solar making up the majority at 16 gigawatts, or 59%. Wind follows closely behind at almost 8 gigawatts, or 28%, while geothermal small hydro, which is 30 megawatts or below, and biofuel account for approximately 3.5 gigawatts, or 13% of our renewable portfolio. In addition, our behind-the-meter solar capacity is approximately 13 gigawatts in California, demonstrating the growing trend towards distributed energy resources. Next slide. Our current battery fleet is 4.5 gigawatts and continues to grow. Next slide. As you see here, the current projection by 2045, we should be somewhere around 45 gigawatts of battery storage on our system. Next slide, please. So on this side, you'll see our current historical records at the California ISO. You'll notice that last year we did achieve our 100% renewable serving California ISO over there. We have 103.5%. And then the previous record was a week earlier at 99.87. So the ability to serve 100% of the grid by renewables is achievable, and we have achieved that. While we seem to be on track to achieving ambitious goals, it's important to note that the transition to a cleaner grid is an ongoing process. As of now, we're currently between 50 to 75% monthly renewables that are serving California ISO load, a significant improvement from just a few years ago. We still have to do a little outreach to reach our ultimate goal of 100% renewable by 2045. This requires continued investment in clean energy technologies and innovation solutions to ensure grid reliability. I'm confident that the right policies and actions in place, we can create a sustainable future for generations to come. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, California's transition to a cleaner grid is a critical step in addressing the urgent challenge of climate change. While we face many challenges ahead, we continue to innovation and collaboration. We can achieve our ambitious goals and create a brighter, more sustainable future for generations to come. I'd like to thank the panel for this. I would like to thank all the attendees for allowing us to share our insights today. If you have any questions or comments, that's you have our email for Darren and myself. Please feel free to reach out, and I appreciate your time and attention. So I think I hit my time mark right there.
Right on the dot there, Sean. That's very brave of you. I was going to say thank you for sharing your email addresses. I think that's a great open invitation to our attendees.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that's been done on the California ISO side and here. So most of the conversations we can talk about for about an hour or so. So within the time frame I had, reach out anytime you guys want.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Sean. I think we're bringing other folks back on the screen here. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. I'll try to combine a few of them so we can try and answer them in the next little while that we have. So one of the things is I think all three jurisdictions have a bit of gas in them, and particularly California and UK. And James, you also mentioned reliance on gas as you're transitioning from coal to clean. We've got a few questions coming in for that. We've talked a lot about how do you manage variable renewables. Could you also speak to some of the challenges with managing thermal generation like coal or gas and what their availability is like and what are some of the challenges with their availability? And maybe as a second follow-up question, could you also speak a little bit to how these natural gas assets are dispatched in a low carbon grid, whether as peakers or otherwise? So challenges to natural gas availability and then how they are dispatched in a low carbon grid.
Yep. Amir, shall I start pick that up and let you come in afterwards? I think probably the key point here is comes back to what I mentioned during my presentation around the existing market structure in GB, which is purely self-dispatch at this point in time. So generators in GB generally are portfolio players where they will have a number of different generation technologies in their hold. And some of that will include renewable energy as well as thermal power plants as well. Now, there's no instruction to them as to which units they are required to run at any particular time. But their contracted position with the suppliers means that they need to meet their contracted position for any half-hour period in any particular day. So it's down to the generators to determine which units they're going to run to meet their position. And clearly, the volumes of renewables that are chosen through the suppliers will have a bearing on that. But the market itself essentially self-dispatches. So whatever the demand is at any particular day, the market price that is available at that point, depending on demand on the system, depending on weather, and depending on availability of natural resources, will drive who ends up being the key player and filling the spark spreads on the day. So the one thing that's probably key to note in that space, though, is that I talked about the location of much of the renewable generation in GB, and undoubtedly that has caused us a significant operational and network infrastructure problem over the last 10 years. So what we're trying to do now is to try and identify additional ways of bringing forward stronger locational signals into the GB market that will attract generation moving to new areas in a self-dispatched market. That has been very difficult. We do have some locational signals in GB, but when the majority of the wind is in the north of the country and offshore, predominantly people who are investing in generation projects will take those projects to the north or will take them offshore. So what we do need to find out in the GB market is an alternative approach. So we're starting to look at the moment at different things like locational margin pricing type examples. So that's essentially where the signal comes from. Amir, do you want to pick up a bit more on that?
I think you just covered most of it. I think it's a free market. I think we have a range of ancillary and balancing services markets that they can also participate in those. I think the last bit of that question was asking about syncoms and synchronous condensers and if they are participating in the UK market. So we have, in order to manage system stability, we have Pathfinder projects, which they are basically try by doing approach to make sure that National Grid ESO, they have access to system stability services, including inertia and short circuit level, without injecting any megawatt to the system. And we've seen three pathfinder projects and tender process being happening in the UK. And Syncoms, they are participating in those markets, and they are providing system stability without injecting 0 megawatts. So the answer to that question is yes.
Great. Awesome. Maybe I'll pass the same question to Sean and Darren to around challenges of managing natural gas generation, and then maybe what the dispatch profile has been like in California.
I can speak a little bit to that. And what we have for challenges on the natural gas fleet is managing the state goals and those retirements with maintaining reliability. And we have had to adjust those retirements and take them out further in order to meet our planning and outlook. And the state has been open to doing that. So it's been key to work together with the state policymakers and do our reliability studies and meet somewhere in between in order to meet those goals. And what we have as a challenge on right now, the push, as Sean's slide indicated, is on storage resources. And with all inverter-based resources that we've integrated into the grid, first with wind and solar, we had challenges on the inverter settings that to provide those grid reliability features and take advantage of that technology. And the technology is there. These are very smart inverters. Sometimes the owners of the resources aren't aware on how to set the ride-through settings. We saw that with solar. And now with the battery storage fleet, we see that sometimes the owners, there's a learning curve on those resources, providing both energy and also what we call regulation up and down, which is the automated generation control. So live management of those resources. And we have had to increase that ancillary service that we call regulation up to higher levels in order to maintain reliability as the gas fleet retires. And we have those variable resources such as solar. In order to meet that, we've had to increase those levels and procure that regulating energy in order to mitigate the impact of those variable energy resources. So state of charge management is really the key. Sean and I are working every day with these resources, sometimes on an individual basis, where we speak to them, the inverter manufacturers, all those settings in order to properly dispatch through the market those storage resources. And that's right now, they are dispatched through the market, the battery storage devices, as all our other resources.
Yeah, and as Darren was saying, it's about communication, right? You want to reach out and talk. It's a new technology to a lot of us. So the more you communicate, the better it'll be for everybody at the end of the day.
No, thanks. We've got some questions on battery storage too, so thanks for answering that. Maybe I'll keep it with you folks, Darren and Sean. We've got some questions also on the distributed energy resources side and the demand side solutions. And Vijika, I might bring you in for that question as well. So it's around looking at what the cost benefit analysis is for higher levels of consumer generation, vehicle to grid integration, and how those resources could be leveraged. So could you start? Yeah, okay. Maybe, and then Darren and Sean. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for this question. And I think that we do have some modelings of this in our long-term scenarios where we cannot answer these questions black or white, because neither the decentralization can function without without any central backup, and also central backup can always be only a central backup, because the availability of future climate neutral gases will be limited, and therefore it's always just a decision between the mixture. And regarding the efficiency, there are clear trends towards a more electrified society and less use of hydrogen in the energy system, just due to the efficiency of the use of hydrogen for re-electrification. And the understanding that we have is that we should use large-scale hydrogen utilities only when it is not avoidable at all, and not as a general strategy for our overall load, and focus on decentral generation. If the society wants that as well. So this is for us basic for a political stakeholder process that we discuss also with our society, and we try to make these questions transparent because it requires a political decision, and we try to put the dialogue on this on the society level as well.
Great, thanks, Vijika. Darren and Sean, I don't know if you want to come in for a minute to answer that, and then we'll start our wrap up.
So yeah, I can speak a little bit. Our market does allow the participation of distributed energy resources into our market. So we're seeing tremendous growth in that area. And what we see as a trend is with hybrid resources, where these resources are coming in on the distribution side and they're pairing solar with storage, and how we manage that in ensuring that we've asked for all the telemetry behind the meter in order for them to fully participate. There are a lot of distributed energy resources and programs that we don't manage, that are managed through the utilities on the distribution side. But we work with them, and about any flavor of resources behind the meter that you can think of, we're seeing, and it's always changing. And so we're always adjusting the market rules and the market design to accommodate those resources as they come in. And so sometimes we're a little bit behind the curve on the market design and being able to integrate those resources. So we're working with the stakeholders to anticipate what the future holds as far as these resources serving both on maybe local needs and also distribution needs and on the grid needs, and receiving the proper information in order to manage those resources. So there's a lot more coming on in that area.
And that's a great final comment, Darren. Thank you everyone for sharing all your experiences. You've shown us across these 3 jurisdictions how transitioning the grid from coal to clean is not easy. There's a lot of challenges everyone discussed, but there's also similarities in the challenges that the different jurisdictions are facing. And we're learning that there are a lot of practical solutions that are being implemented, and more that are continuing to be developed. And I think one other insight for me is that this includes more than just technologies. A lot of you folks also talked about market design and policy solutions that are needed for this. To wrap up, I have one final question. If our participants want to learn more about lessons learned, where can they find more resources? Maybe I'll pass it to Darren and Sean, as I think you're part of some international coalitions. Other speakers, if you can add your resources to the chat, that would be great.
So, a lot of the slides that Sean has showed are on our website, the KAISO website. So because we have the stakeholders are very interested in the renewable integration and our policies and initiatives on that, you can either go to our site. If you have trouble finding anything, just contact Sean or I through email, and we can direct you to where you can find that information.
Great. Thanks, Darren. Yeah, I think we'll pop some of these resources into the chat, as well as they'll be available on our website where we share our recording. I want to wrap up here. A huge thank you to our speakers for all your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to be doing more of these sessions. So if you want to sign up, please register for our newsletter, also on our website. Have a good day all. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.